Chapter 35 of the Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 35. La Mazzolata. "Gentlemen," said the Count of Monte Cristo as he entered, "I pray you excuse me for suffering my visit to be anticipated, but I feared to disturb you by presenting myself earlier at your apartments. Besides, you sent me word that you would come to me, and I have held myself at your disposal." "France and I have to thank you 1,000 times, Count," returned Albert. "You extricated us from a great dilemma, and we were on the point of inventing a very fantastic vehicle when your friendly invitation reached us." "Indeed," returned the Count, motioning the two young men to sit down. "It was the fault of that blockhead Pastrini that I did not sooner assist you in your distress. He did not mention a syllable of your embarrassment to me, when he knows that, alone and isolated as I am, I seek every opportunity of making the acquaintance of my neighbors. As soon as I learned that I could in any way assist you, I most eagerly seized the opportunity of offering my services." The two young men bowed. Franz had, as yet, found nothing to say. He had come to no determination, and as nothing in the Count's manner manifested the wish that he should recognize him, he did not know whether to make any allusion to the past, or wait until he had more proof. Besides, although sure it was he who had been in the box the previous evening, he could not be equally positive that this was the man he had seen in the Colosseum. He resolved, therefore, to let things take their course without making any direct overture to the Count. Moreover, he had this advantage: he was master of the Count's secret, while the Count had no hold on Franz, who had nothing to conceal. However, he resolved to lead the conversation to a subject which might possibly clear up his doubts. "Count," said he, "you have offered us places in your carriage, and at your windows in the Rospoli Palace. Can you tell us where we can obtain a sight of the Piazza del Popolo?" "Ah," said the Count negligently, looking attentively at Morcerf. "Is there not something like an execution upon the Piazza del Popolo?" "Yes," returned Franz, finding that the Count was coming to the point he wished. "Stay, I think I told my steward yesterday to attend to this. Perhaps I can render you this slight service also." He extended his hand, and rang the bell thrice. "Did you ever occupy yourself," said he to Franz, "with the employment of time and the means of simplifying the summoning your servants?" "I have. When I ring once, it is for my valet, twice for my major domo, thrice for my steward. Thus I do not waste a minute or a word. Here he is." A man of about 45 or 50 entered, exactly resembling the smuggler who had introduced Franz into the cavern, but he did not appear to recognize him. It was evident he had his orders. "Monsieur Bertuccio," said the Count, "you have procured me windows looking on the Piazza del Popolo, as I ordered you yesterday." "Yes, Excellency," returned the steward, "but it was very late." "Did I not tell you I wished for one?" replied the Count, frowning. "And your Excellency has one, which was let to Prince Lobaniev, but I was obliged to pay 100. "That will do, Monsieur Bertuccio. Spare these gentlemen all such domestic arrangements. You have the window, that is sufficient. Give orders to the coachman, and be in readiness on the stairs to conduct us to it." The steward bowed, and was about to quit the room. "Ah," continued the Count, "be good enough to ask Pastrini if he has received the tavoletta, and if he can send us an account of the execution." "There is no need to do that," said Franz, taking out his tablets, "for I saw the account and copied it down." "Very well. You can retire, Monsieur Bertuccio, but let us know when breakfast is ready. These gentlemen," added he, turning to the two friends, "will, I trust, do me the honor to breakfast with me." "But, my dear Count," said Albert, "we shall abuse your kindness." "Not at all. On the contrary, you will give me great pleasure. You will, one or other of you, perhaps both, return it to me at Paris. Monsieur Bertuccio, lay covers for 3. He then took Franz's tablets out of his hand. "We announce," he read in the same tone with which he would have read a newspaper, "that today the 23rd of February, will be executed Andrea Rondolo, guilty of murder on the person of the respected and venerated Don Cesare Tolini, canon of the Church of St. John Lateran, and Peppino, called Rocca Priori, convicted of complicity with the detestable bandit Luigi Vampa and the men of his band. The first will be mazzolato, the second decapitato. Yes, continued the Count, it was at first arranged in this way, but I think since yesterday some change has taken place in the order of the ceremony. Really? Said Franz. Yes. I passed the evening at the Cardinal Rospigliosi's, and there mention was made of something like a pardon for one of the two men. For Andrea Rondolo? Asked Franz. No, replied the Count, carelessly. For the other. He glanced at the tablets as if to recall the name. For Peppino, called Rocca Priori. You are thus deprived of seeing a man guillotined, but the mazzuola still remains, which is a very curious punishment when seen for the first time, and even the second, while the other, as you must know, is very simple. The mandaia never fails, never trembles, never strikes 30 times ineffectually, like the soldier who beheaded the Count of Chalais, and to whose tender mercy Richelieu had doubtless recommended the sufferer. Ah, added the Count, in a contemptuous tone, do not tell me of the European punishments. They are in the infancy, or rather the old age, of cruelty. Really, Count, replied Franz, one would think that you had studied the different tortures of all the nations of the world. There are, at least, few that I have not seen, said the Count coldly. And you took pleasure in beholding these dreadful spectacles? My first sentiment was horror, the second indifference, the third curiosity. Curiosity? That is a terrible word. Why so? In life, our greatest preoccupation is death. Is it not, then, curious to study the different ways by which the soul and body can part, and how, according to their different characters, temperaments, and even different customs of their countries, different persons bear the transition from life to death, from existence to annihilation? As for myself, I can assure you of one thing. The more men you see die, the easier it becomes to die yourself, and in my opinion, death may be a torture, but it is not an expiation. I do not quite understand you, replied Franz. Pray, explain your meaning, for you excite my curiosity to the highest pitch. Listen, said the Count, and deep hatred mounted to his face, as the blood would to the face of any other. If a man had, by unheard of and excruciating tortures, destroyed your father, your mother, your betrothed, a being who, when torn from you, left a desolation, a wound that never closes in your breast, do you think the reparation that society gives you is sufficient when it interposes the knife of the guillotine between the base of the occiput and trapezoidal muscles of the murderer, and allows him who has caused us years of moral sufferings to escape with a few moments of physical pain? Yes, I know, said Franz, that human justice is insufficient to console us. She can give blood in return for blood, that is all. But you must demand from her only what is in her power to grant. I will put another case to you, continued the Count, that where society, attacked by the death of a person, avenges death by death. But are there not 1,000 tortures by which a man may be made to suffer without society taking the least cognizance of them, or offering him even the insufficient means of vengeance, of which we have just spoken? Are there not crimes for which the impalement of the Turks, the augurs of the Persians, the stake and the brand of the Iroquois Indians are inadequate tortures, and which are unpunished by society? Answer me, do not these crimes exist? Yes, answered Franz, and it is to punish them that dueling is tolerated. Ah, dueling, cried the Count, a pleasant manner, upon my soul, of arriving at your end, when that end is vengeance. A man has carried off your mistress, a man has seduced your wife, a man has dishonored your daughter. He has rendered the whole life of one who had the right to expect from heaven that portion of happiness God has promised to every one of his creatures, an existence of misery and infamy. And you think you are avenged because you send a ball through the head, or pass a sword through the breast, of that man who has planted madness in your brain and despair in your heart? And remember, moreover, that it is often he who comes off victorious from the strife, absolved of all crimes in the eyes of the world. No, no, continued the Count. Had I to avenge myself, it is not thus that I would take revenge. Then you disapprove of dueling? You would not fight a duel? Asked Albert in his turn, astonished at this strange theory. Oh yes, replied the Count. Understand me, I would fight a duel, for a trifle, for an insult, for a blow. And the more so that, thanks to my skill in all bodily exercises, and the indifference to danger I have gradually acquired, I should be almost certain to kill my man. Oh, I would fight for such a cause, but in return for a slow, profound, eternal torture, I would give back the same, were it possible. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, as the Orientalists say, are masters in everything. Those favored creatures who have formed for themselves a life of dreams and a paradise of realities. But, Franz said to the Count, with this theory, which renders you at once judge and executioner of your own cause, it would be difficult to adopt a course that would forever prevent your falling under the power of the law. Hatred is blind, rage carries you away, and he who pours out vengeance runs the risk of tasting a bitter draught. Yes, if he be poor and inexperienced, not if he be rich and skilful. Besides, the worst that could happen to him would be the punishment of which we have already spoken, and which the philanthropic French Revolution has substituted for being torn to pieces by horses, or broken on the wheel. What matters this punishment, as long as he is avenged? On my word, I almost regret that in all probability this miserable Peppino will not be beheaded, as you might have had an opportunity of then seeing how short a time the punishment lasts, and whether it is worth even mentioning. But, really, this is a most singular conversation for the carnival, gentlemen. How did it arise? Ah, I recollect. You asked for a place at my window. You shall have it. But first let us sit down to table, for here comes the servant to inform us that breakfast is ready. As he spoke, a servant opened one of the 4 doors in the apartment, saying, Al suo comodo. The 2 young men rose, and entered the breakfast-room. During the meal, which was excellent and admirably served, Franz looked repeatedly at Albert, in order to observe the impressions which he doubted not had been made on him by the words of their entertainer. But whether, with his usual carelessness, he had paid but little attention to him, whether the explanation of the Count of Monte Cristo with regard to dueling had satisfied him, or whether the events which Franz knew of had had their effect on him alone, he remarked that his companion did not pay the least regard to them, but on the contrary ate like a man who, for the last 4 or 5 months, had been condemned to partake of Italian cookery, that is, the worst in the world. As for the Count, he just touched the dishes. He seemed to fulfill the duties of a host by sitting down with his guests, and awaited their departure to be served with some strange or more delicate food. This brought back to Franz, in spite of himself, the recollection of the terror with which the Count had inspired the Countess G, and her firm conviction that the man in the opposite box was a vampire. At the end of the breakfast, Franz took out his watch. "Well," said the Count, "what are you doing?" "You must excuse us, Count," returned Franz, "but we still have much to do." "What may that be?" "We have no masks, and it is absolutely necessary to procure them." "Do not concern yourself about that. We have, I think, a private room in the Piazza del Popolo. I will have whatever costumes you choose brought to us, and you can dress there." "After the execution?" cried Franz. "Before or after, whichever you please. Opposite the scaffold? The scaffold forms part of the fete." "Count, I have reflected on the matter," said Franz. "I thank you for your courtesy, but I shall content myself with accepting a place in your carriage, and at your window at the Rospoli Palace, and I leave you at liberty to dispose of my place at the Piazza del Popolo." "But I warn you, you will lose a very curious sight," returned the Count. You will describe it to me, replied Franz, and the recital from your lips will make as great an impression on me as if I had witnessed it. I have more than once intended witnessing an execution, but I have never been able to make up my mind. And you, Albert? Replied the Viscount. I saw Castaigne executed, but I think I was rather intoxicated that day, for I had quitted college the same morning, and we had passed the previous night at a tavern. Besides, it is no reason, because you have not seen an execution at Paris, that you should not see one anywhere else. When you travel, it is to see everything. Think what a figure you'll make when you are asked, "How do they execute in Rome?" And you reply, "I do not know." And besides, they say the culprit is an infamous scoundrel, who killed with a log of wood a worthy canon, who had brought him up like his own son. Diable! When a churchman is killed, it should be with a different weapon than a log, especially when he has behaved like a father. If you went to Spain, would you not see a bullfight? Well, suppose it is a bullfight you are going to see. Recollect the ancient Romans of the circus, and the sports where they killed 300 lions and 100 men. Think of the 80,000 applauding spectators, the sage matrons who took their daughters, and the charming vestals who made with the thumb of their white hands the fatal sign that said, "Come, dispatch the dying." "Shall you go then, Albert?" asked Franz. "Ma foi, yes. Like you, I hesitated, but the Count's eloquence decides me." "Let us go then," said Franz, "since you wish it, but on our way to the Piazza del Popolo, I wish to pass through the Corso. Is that possible, Count? On foot, yes. In a carriage, no. I will go on foot then. Is it important that you should go that way? Yes, there is something I wish to see. Well, we will go by the Corso. We will send the carriage to wait for us on the Piazza del Popolo, by the Strada del Babuino. For I shall be glad to pass, myself, through the Corso, to see if some orders I have given have been executed." "Excellency," said a servant, opening the door, "a man in the dress of a penitent wishes to speak to you." "Ah, yes," returned the Count. "I know who he is. Gentlemen, will you return to the salon? You will find good cigars on the center table. I will be with you directly." The young men rose and returned into the salon, while the Count, again apologizing, left by another door. Albert, who was a great smoker, and who had considered it no small sacrifice to be deprived of the cigars of the Café de Paris, approached the table and uttered a cry of joy at perceiving some veritable puros. "Well," asked Franz, "what do you think of the Count of Monte Cristo?" "What do I think?" said Albert, evidently surprised at such a question from his companion. "I think he is a delightful fellow, who does the honors of his table admirably, who has travelled much, read much, is, like Brutus, of the Stoic school, and, moreover," added he, sending a volume of smoke up toward the ceiling, "that he has excellent cigars." Such was Albert's opinion of the Count, and as Franz well knew that Albert professed never to form an opinion except upon long reflection, he made no attempt to change it. "But," said he, "did you observe one very singular thing?" "What?" "How attentively he looked at you." "At me?" "Yes." Albert reflected. "Ah," replied he, sighing, "that is not very surprising. I have been more than a year absent from Paris, and my clothes are of a most antiquated cut. The Count takes me for a provincial. The first opportunity you have, undeceive him, I beg, and tell him I am nothing of the kind." Franz smiled, an instant after the Count entered. "I am now quite at your service, gentlemen," said he. "The carriage is going one way to the Piazza del Popolo, and we will go another, and, if you please, by the Corso. Take some more of these cigars, Monsieur de Morcerf." "With all my heart," returned Albert. "Italian cigars are horrible. When you come to Paris, I will return all this." "I will not refuse. I intend going there soon, and, since you allow me, I will pay you a visit. Come, we have not any time to lose. It is 12:30. Let us set off." All three descended, the coachman received his master's orders, and drove down the Via del Babuino, while the three gentlemen walked along the Piazza di Spagna and the Via Fratina, which led directly between the Fiano and Rospoli palaces. Franz's attention was directed toward the windows of the last palace, for he had not forgotten the signal agreed upon between the man in the mantle and the Trastevere peasant. "Which are your windows?" he asked of the Count, with as much indifference as he could assume. "The three last," returned he, with a negligence evidently unaffected, for he could not imagine with what intention the question was put. Franz glanced rapidly toward the three windows. The side windows were hung with yellow damask, and the center one with white damask and a red cross. The man in the mantle had kept his promise to the Trastevere, and there could now be no doubt that he was the Count. The three windows were still untenanted. Preparations were making on every side. Chairs were placed, scaffolds were raised, and windows were hung with flags. The masks could not appear. The carriages could not move about, but the masks were visible behind the windows, the carriages, and the doors. Franz, Albert, and the Count continued to descend the Corso. As they approached the Piazza del Popolo, the crowd became more dense, and above the heads of the multitude 2 objects were visible: the obelisk, surmounted by a cross, which marks the center of the square, and in front of the obelisk, at a point where the 3 streets, del Babuino, del Corso, and di Ripetta, meet, the 2 uprights of the scaffold, between which glittered the curved knife of the mandaia. At the corner of the street they met the Count's steward, who was awaiting his master. The window, let at an exorbitant price, which the Count had doubtless wished to conceal from his guests, was on the 2nd floor of the great palace, situated between the Via del Babuino and the Monte Pincio. It consisted, as we have said, of a small dressing-room opening into a bedroom, and, when the door of communication was shut, the inmates were quite alone. On chairs were laid elegant masquerade costumes of blue and white satin. "As you left the choice of your costumes to me," said the Count to the 2 friends, "I have had these brought, as they will be the most worn this year, and they are most suitable, on account of the confetti, sweetmeats, as they do not show the flour." Franz heard the words of the Count but imperfectly, and he perhaps did not fully appreciate this new attention to their wishes, for he was wholly absorbed by the spectacle that the Piazza del Popolo presented, and by the terrible instrument that was in the center. It was the first time Franz had ever seen a guillotine. We say guillotine because the Roman mandaia is formed on almost the same model as the French instrument. The knife, which is shaped like a crescent, that cuts with the convex side, falls from a less height, and that is all the difference. 2 men, seated on the movable plank on which the victim is laid, were eating their breakfasts, while waiting for the criminal. Their repast consisted apparently of bread and sausages. One of them lifted the plank, took out a flask of wine, drank some, and then passed it to his companion. These 2 men were the executioner's assistants. At this sight, Franz felt the perspiration start forth upon his brow. The prisoners, transported the previous evening from the Carcere Nuovo to the little church of Santa Maria del Popolo, had passed the night, each accompanied by 2 priests, in a chapel closed by a grating, before which were 2 sentinels, who were relieved at intervals. A double line of carbineers, placed on each side of the door of the church, reached to the scaffold, and formed a circle around it, leaving a path about 10 feet wide, and around the guillotine a space of nearly 100 feet. All the rest of the square was paved with heads. Many women held their infants on their shoulders, and thus the children had the best view. The Monte Pincio seemed a vast amphitheater filled with spectators. The balconies of the 2 churches at the corner of the Via del Babuino and the Via di Ripetta were crammed. The steps even seemed a parti-colored sea that was impelled toward the portico. Every niche in the wall held its living statue. What the Count said was true. The most curious spectacle in life is that of death. And yet, instead of the silence and solemnity demanded by the occasion, laughter and jests arose from the crowd. It was evident that the execution was, in the eyes of the people, only the commencement of the carnival. Suddenly the tumult ceased, as if by magic, and the doors of the church opened. A brotherhood of penitents, clothed from head to foot in robes of grey sackcloth, with holes for eyes, and holding in their hands lighted tapers, appeared first. The chief marched at the head. Behind the penitents came a man of vast stature and proportions. He was naked, with the exception of cloth drawers, at the left side of which hung a large knife in a sheath, and he bore on his right shoulder a heavy iron sledge-hammer. This man was the executioner. He had, moreover, sandals bound to his feet by cords. Behind the executioner came, in the order in which they were to die, first Peppino, then Andrea. Each was accompanied by 2 priests. Neither had his eyes bandaged. Peppino walked with a firm step, doubtless aware of what awaited him. Andrea was supported by 2 priests. Each of them, from time to time, kissed the crucifix which a confessor held out to them. At this sight alone, Franz felt his legs tremble under him. He looked at Albert. He was as white as his shirt, and mechanically cast away his cigar, although he had not half smoked it. The Count alone seemed unmoved. Nay, more, a slight colour seemed striving to rise in his pale cheeks. His nostrils dilated, like those of a wild beast that scents its prey, and his lips, half opened, disclosed his white teeth, small and sharp like those of a jackal. And yet his features wore an expression of smiling tenderness, such as Franz had never before witnessed in them. His black eyes especially were full of kindness and pity. However, the 2 culprits advanced, and as they approached, their faces became visible. Peppino was a handsome young man of 4 or 5 and 20, bronzed by the sun. He carried his head erect, and seemed on the watch to see on which side his liberator would appear. Andrea was short and fat. His visage, marked with brutal cruelty, did not indicate age. He might be 30. In prison he had suffered his beard to grow. His head fell on his shoulder, his legs bent beneath him, and his movements were apparently automatic and unconscious. "I thought," said Franz to the Count, "that you told me there would be but 1 execution." "I told you true," replied he coldly. "And yet here are 2 culprits." "Yes, but only one of these 2 is about to die. The other has many years to live. If the pardon is to come, there is no time to lose." "And see, here it is," said the Count. At the moment when Peppino reached the foot of the mandaia, a priest arrived in some haste, forced his way through the soldiers, and, advancing to the chief of the brotherhood, gave him a folded paper. The piercing eye of Peppino had noticed all. The chief took the paper, unfolded it, and raising his hand, "Heaven be praised, and His Holiness also," he said in a loud voice. "Here is a pardon for one of the prisoners." "A pardon?" cried the people in one voice. "A pardon?" At this point Andrea raised his head. "Pardon for whom?" cried he. Peppino remained breathless. "A pardon for Peppino, called Rocca Priori," said the principal friar, and he passed the paper to the officer commanding the carbineers, who read and returned it to him. "For Peppino!" cried Andrea, who seemed roused from the torpor in which he had been plunged. "Why for him and not for me? We ought to die together. I was promised he should die with me. You have no right to put me to death alone. I will not die alone. I will not." And he broke from the priests, struggling and raving like a wild beast, and striving desperately to break the cords that bound his hands. The executioner made a sign, and his 2 assistants leaped from the scaffold and seized him. "What is going on?" asked Franz of the Count, for, as all the talk was in the Roman dialect, he had not perfectly understood it. "Do you not see," returned the Count, "that this human creature who is about to die is furious that his fellow-sufferer does not perish with him, and, were he able, he would rather tear him to pieces with his teeth and nails than let him enjoy the life he himself is about to be deprived of. Oh, man, a race of crocodiles!" cried the Count, extending his clenched hands toward the crowd. "How well do I recognize you there, and that at all times you are worthy of yourselves." Meanwhile, Andrea and the 2 executioners were struggling on the ground, and he kept exclaiming, "He ought to die! He shall die! I will not die alone!" "Look, look!" cried the Count, seizing the young man's hands. "Look, for on my soul it is curious. Here is a man who had resigned himself to his fate, who was going to the scaffold to die, like a coward, it is true, but he was about to die without resistance. Do you know what gave him strength? Do you know what consoled him? It was that another partook in his punishment, that another partook of his anguish, that another was to die before him. Lead 2 sheep to the butcher's, 2 oxen to the slaughterhouse, and make one of them understand that his companion will not die. The sheep will bleat for pleasure, the ox will bellow with joy. But man whom God created in his own image, man upon whom God has laid his sole commandment to love his neighbor, man to whom God has given a voice to express his thoughts. What is his first cry when he hears his fellow man is saved? A blasphemy. Honor to man, this masterpiece of nature, this king of the creation." And the Count burst into a laugh, a terrible laugh, that showed he must have suffered horribly to be able thus to laugh. However, the struggle still continued, and it was dreadful to witness. The people all took part against Andrea, and 20,000 voices cried, "Put him to death! Put him to death!" Franz sprang back, but the Count seized his arm and held him before the window. "What are you doing?" said he. "Do you pity him? If you heard the cry of 'mad dog,' you would take your gun. You would unhesitatingly shoot the poor beast, who, after all, was only guilty of having been bitten by another dog. And yet you pity a man who, without being bitten by one of his own race, has yet murdered his benefactor, and who, now unable to kill anyone because his hands are bound, wishes to see his companion in captivity perish. No, no, look, look!" The command was needless. Franz was fascinated by the horrible spectacle. The 2 assistants had borne Andrea to the scaffold, and there, in spite of his struggles, his bites, and his cries, had forced him to his knees. During this time the executioner had raised his mace, and signed to them to get out of the way. The criminal strove to rise, but ere he had time, the mace fell on his left temple. A dull and heavy sound was heard, and the man dropped like an ox on his face, and then turned over on his back. The executioner let fall his mace, drew his knife, and with one stroke opened his throat, and mounting on his stomach, stamped violently on it with his feet. At every stroke a jet of blood sprang from the wound. This time Franz could contain himself no longer, but sank, half fainting, into a seat. Albert, with his eyes closed, was standing grasping the window curtains. The Count was erect and triumphant, like the avenging angel. End of Chapter 35.
Chapter 36 of The Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 36. The Carnival at Rome. When Franz recovered his senses, he saw Albert drinking a glass of water, of which, to judge from his pallor, he stood in great need, and the Count, who was assuming his masquerade costume. He glanced mechanically towards the square. The scene was wholly changed. Scaffold, executioners, victims, all had disappeared. Only the people remained, full of noise and excitement. The bell of Monte Cristo, which only sounds on the Pope's decease and the opening of the Carnival, was ringing a joyous peal. "Well," asked he of the Count, "what has then happened?" "Nothing," replied the Count, "only, as you see, the Carnival has commenced. Make haste and dress yourself." "In fact," said Franz, "this horrible scene has passed away like a dream." "It is but a dream, a nightmare that has disturbed you." "Yes, that I have suffered. But the culprit?" "That is a dream also, only he has remained asleep, while you have awakened. And who knows which of you is the most fortunate?" "But Peppino, what has become of him?" "Peppino is a lad of sense, who, unlike most men, who are happy in proportion as they are noticed, was delighted to see that the general attention was directed towards his companion. He profited by this distraction to slip away among the crowd, without even thanking the worthy priest who accompanied him. Decidedly, man is an ungrateful and egotistical animal. But dress yourself. See, Monsieur de Morcerf sets you the example. Albert was drawing on the satin pantaloon over his black trousers and varnished boots. "Well, Albert," said Franz, "do you feel much inclined to join the revels? Come, answer frankly." "Ma foi, no," returned Albert, "but I am really glad to have seen such a sight. And I understand what the Count said, that when you have once habituated yourself to a similar spectacle, it is the only one that causes you any emotion." "Without reflecting that this is the only moment in which you can study character," said the Count. "On the steps of the scaffold, death tears off the mask that has been worn through life, and the real visage is disclosed. It must be allowed that Andrea was not very handsome, the hideous scoundrel. Come, dress yourselves, gentlemen, dress yourselves." Franz felt it would be ridiculous not to follow his two companions' example. He assumed his costume, and fastened on the mask that scarcely equalled the pallor of his own face. Their toilet finished, they descended. The carriage awaited them at the door, filled with sweetmeats and bouquets. They fell into the line of carriages. It is difficult to form an idea of the perfect change that had taken place. Instead of the spectacle of gloomy and silent death, the Piazza del Popolo presented a spectacle of gay and noisy mirth and revelry. A crowd of masks flowed in from all sides, emerging from the doors, descending from the windows. From every street and every corner drove carriages, filled with clowns, harlequins, dominos, mummers, pantomimists, transteverins, knights, and peasants, screaming, fighting, gesticulating, throwing eggs filled with flour, confetti, nosegays, attacking with their sarcasms and their missiles, friends and foes, companions and strangers, indiscriminately, and no one took offense, or did anything but laugh. Franz and Albert were like men who, to drive away a violent sorrow, have recourse to wine, and who, as they drink and become intoxicated, feel a thick veil drawn between the past and the present. They saw, or rather continued to see, the image of what they had witnessed. But little by little the general vertigo seized them, and they felt themselves obliged to take part in the noise and confusion. A handful of confetti that came from a neighbouring carriage, and which, while it covered Morcerf and his two companions with dust, pricked his neck and that portion of his face uncovered by his mask like 100 pins, incited him to join in the general combat, in which all the masks around him were engaged. He rose in his turn, and seizing handfuls of confetti and sweetmeats, with which the carriage was filled, cast them with all the force and skill he was master of. The strife had fairly begun, and the recollection of what they had seen half an hour before was gradually effaced from the young men's minds, so much were they occupied by the gay and glittering procession they now beheld. As for the Count of Monte Cristo, he had never for an instant shown any appearance of having been moved. Imagine the large and splendid Corso, bordered from one end to the other with lofty palaces, with their balconies hung with carpets, and their windows with flags. At these balconies are 300,000 spectators, Romans, Italians, strangers from all parts of the world, the united aristocracy of birth, wealth, and genius. Lovely women, yielding to the influence of the scene, bend over their balconies, or lean from their windows, and shower down confetti, which are returned by bouquets. The air seems darkened with the falling confetti and flying flowers. In the streets, the lively crowd is dressed in the most fantastic costumes. Gigantic cabbages walk gravely about. Buffaloes' heads bellow from men's shoulders. Dogs walk on their hind legs. In the midst of all this, a mask is lifted, and, as in Callot's Temptation of St. Anthony, a lovely face is exhibited, which we would fain follow, but from which we are separated by troops of fiends. This will give a faint idea of the carnival at Rome. At the second turn, the Count stopped the carriage, and requested permission to withdraw, leaving the vehicle at their disposal. Franz looked up. They were opposite the Rospoli Palace. At the centre window, the one hung with white damask with a red cross, was a blue domino, beneath which Franz's imagination easily pictured the beautiful Greek of the Argentina. "Gentlemen," said the Count, springing out, "when you are tired of being actors, and wish to become spectators of this scene, you know you have places at my windows. In the meantime, dispose of my coachman, my carriage, and my servants." We have forgotten to mention that the Count's coachman was attired in a bearskin exactly resembling Audrey's in The Bear and the Pasha, and the 2 footmen behind were dressed up as green monkeys, with spring masks, with which they made grimaces at every one who passed. Franz thanked the Count for his attention. As for Albert, he was busily occupied throwing bouquets at a carriage full of Roman peasants that was passing near him. Unfortunately for him, the line of carriages moved on again, and while he descended the Piazza del Popolo, the other ascended towards the Palazzo di Venezia. "Ah, my dear fellow," said he to Franz, "you did not see?" "What?" "There, that calash filled with Roman peasants." "No." "Well, I am convinced they are all charming women." "How unfortunate that you were masked, Albert," said Franz. "Here was an opportunity of making up for past disappointments." "Oh," replied he, half laughing, half serious, "I hope the carnival will not pass without some amends in one shape or the other." But in spite of Albert's hope, the day passed unmarked by any incident, excepting 2 or 3 encounters with the carriage full of Roman peasants. At one of these encounters, accidentally or purposely, Albert's mask fell off. He instantly rose and cast the remainder of the bouquets into the carriage. Doubtless one of the charming females Albert had detected beneath their coquettish disguise was touched by his gallantry, for as the carriage of the 2 friends passed her, she threw a bunch of violets. Albert seized it, and as Franz had no reason to suppose it was meant for him, he suffered Albert to retain it. Albert placed it in his buttonhole, and the carriage went triumphantly on. "Well," said Franz to him, "there is the beginning of an adventure." "Laugh if you please, I really think so I will not abandon this bouquet." "Pardieu," returned Franz, laughing, "in token of your ingratitude." The jest, however, soon appeared to become earnest, for when Albert and Franz again encountered the carriage with the contadini, the one who had thrown the violets to Albert clapped her hands when she beheld them in his buttonhole. "Bravo, bravo!" said Franz. "Things go wonderfully. Shall I leave you? Perhaps you would prefer being alone?" "No," replied he. "I will not be caught like a fool at a first disclosure by a rendezvous under the clock, as they say at the opera balls. If the fair peasant wishes to carry matters any further, we shall find her, or rather, she will find us, tomorrow. Then she will give me some sign or other, and I shall know what I have to do." "On my word," said Franz, "you are wise as Nestor and prudent as Ulysses, and your fair Circe must be very skillful or very powerful if she succeed in changing you into a beast of any kind." Albert was right. The fair unknown had resolved, doubtless, to carry the intrigue no further, for although the young men made several more turns, they did not again see the calash, which had turned up one of the neighbouring streets. Then they returned to the Rospoli Palace, but the Count and the blue domino had also disappeared. The 2 windows, hung with yellow damask, were still occupied by the persons whom the Count had invited. At this moment the same bell that had proclaimed the beginning of the mascherata sounded the retreat. The file on the Corso broke the line, and in a second all the carriages had disappeared. Franz and Albert were opposite the Via delle Maratte. The coachman, without saying a word, drove up it, passed along the Piazza di Spagni and the Rospoli Palace, and stopped at the door of the hotel. Signor Pastrini came to the door to receive his guests. Franz hastened to inquire after the Count, and to express regret that he had not returned in sufficient time. But Pastrini reassured him by saying that the Count of Monte Cristo had ordered a second carriage for himself, and that it had gone at 4 o'clock to fetch him from the Rospoli Palace. The Count had, moreover, charged him to offer the 2 friends the key of his box at the Argentina. Franz questioned Albert as to his intentions, but Albert had great projects to put into execution before going to the theatre, and instead of making any answer, he inquired if Signor Pastrini could procure him a tailor. "A tailor?" said the host. "And for what?" "To make us between now and tomorrow 2 Roman peasant costumes," returned Albert. The host shook his head. "To make you 2 costumes between now and tomorrow? I ask your Excellency's pardon, but this is quite a French demand. For the next week you will not find a single tailor who would consent to sew 6 buttons on a waistcoat, if you paid him a crown apiece for each button." "Then I must give up the idea?" "No, we have them ready-made. Leave all to me, and tomorrow, when you awake, you shall find a collection of costumes with which you will be satisfied." "My dear Albert," said Franz, "leave all to our host. He has already proved himself full of resources. Let us dine quietly, and afterwards go and see the Algerian captive." "Agreed," returned Albert. "But remember, Signor Pastrini, that both my friend and myself attach the greatest importance to having tomorrow the costumes we have asked for." The host again assured them they might rely on him, and that their wishes should be attended to. Upon which Franz and Albert mounted to their apartments, and proceeded to disencumber themselves of their costumes. Albert, as he took off his dress, carefully preserved the bunch of violets. It was his token reserved for the morrow. The two friends sat down to table, but they could not refrain from remarking the difference between the Count of Monte Cristo's table and that of Signor Pastrini. Truth compelled Franz, in spite of the dislike he seemed to have taken to the Count, to confess that the advantage was not on Pastrini's side. During dessert, the servant inquired at what time they wished for the carriage. Albert and Franz looked at each other, fearing really to abuse the Count's kindness. The servant understood them. His Excellency the Count of Monte Cristo had, he said, given positive orders that the carriage was to remain at their lordship's orders all day, and they could therefore dispose of it without fear of indiscretion. They resolved to profit by the Count's courtesy, and ordered the horses to be harnessed, while they substituted evening dress for that which they had on, and which was somewhat the worse for the numerous combats they had sustained. This precaution taken, they went to the theatre and installed themselves in the Count's box. During the first act, the Countess G entered. Her first look was at the box where she had seen the Count the previous evening, so that she perceived Franz and Albert in the place of the very person concerning whom she had expressed so strange an opinion to Franz. Her opera-glass was so fixedly directed towards them that Franz saw it would be cruel not to satisfy her curiosity, and availing himself of one of the privileges of the spectators of the Italian theatres, who use their boxes to hold receptions, the two friends went to pay their respects to the Countess. Scarcely had they entered when she motioned to Franz to assume the seat of honour. Albert, in his turn, sat behind. "Well," said she, hardly giving Franz time to sit down, "it seems you have nothing better to do than to make the acquaintance of this new Lord Ruthven, and you are already the best friends in the world." "Without being so far advanced as that, my dear Countess," returned Franz, "I cannot deny that we have abused his good nature all day." "All day?" "Yes. This morning we breakfasted with him, we rode in his carriage all day, and now we have taken possession of his box." "You know him, then?" "Yes, and no." "How so?" "It is a long story." "Tell it to me." "It would frighten you too much." "So much the more reason. At least wait until the story has a conclusion." "Very well, I prefer complete histories, but tell me how you made his acquaintance. Did anyone introduce you to him?" "No, it was he who introduced himself to us." "When?" "Last night, after we left you." "Through what medium?" "The very prosaic one of our landlord." "Is he staying, then, at the Hôtel de Londres with you?" "Not only in the same hotel, but on the same floor." "What is his name? For, of course, you know." "The Count of Monte Cristo." "That is not a family name." "No, it is the name of the island he has purchased." "And he is a count?" "A Tuscan count." "Well, we must put up with that," said the Countess, who was herself from one of the oldest Venetian families. "What sort of a man is he?" "Ask the Vicomte de Morcerf." "You hear, Monsieur de Morcerf, I am referred to you," said the Countess. "We should be very hard to please, madam," returned Albert, "did we not think him delightful. A friend of 10 years' standing could not have done more for us, or with a more perfect courtesy." "Come," observed the Countess, smiling, "I see my vampire is only some millionaire, who has taken the appearance of Lara in order to avoid being confounded with Monsieur de Rothschild. And you have seen her?" "Her?" "The beautiful Greek of yesterday." "No. We heard, I think, the sound of her guzla, but she remained perfectly invisible." "When you say invisible," interrupted Albert, "it is only to keep up the mystery. For whom do you take the blue domino at the window with the white curtains?" "Where was this window with white hangings?" asked the Countess. "At the Rospoli Palace." "The Count had 3 windows at the Rospoli Palace?" "Yes. Did you pass through the Corso?" "Yes." "Well, did you notice 2 windows hung with yellow damask, and one with white damask with a red cross? Those were the Count's windows." "Why, he must be a nabob. Do you know what those 3 windows were worth?" 200 or 300 Roman crowns?" 2,000 or 3,000. "The deuce!" "Does his island produce him such a revenue?" "It does not bring him a bajocco." "Then why did he purchase it?" "For a whim." "He is an original, then." "In reality," observed Albert, "he seemed to me somewhat eccentric. Were he at Paris, and a frequenter of the theatres, I should say he was a poor devil literally mad. This morning he made 2 or 3 exits worthy of Didier or Antony." At this moment a fresh visitor entered, and according to custom, Franz gave up his seat to him. This circumstance had, moreover, the effect of changing the conversation. An hour afterwards the two friends returned to their hotel. Signor Pastrini had already set about procuring their disguises for the morrow, and he assured them that they would be perfectly satisfied. The next morning at 9 o'clock he entered Franz's room, followed by a tailor, who had 8 or 10 Roman peasant costumes on his arm. They selected 2 exactly alike, and charged the tailor to sew on each of their hats about 20 yards of ribbon, and to procure them 2 of the long silk sashes of different colours, with which the lower orders decorate themselves on fête days. Albert was impatient to see how he looked in his new dress: a jacket and breeches of blue velvet, silk stockings with clocks, shoes with buckles, and a silk waistcoat. This picturesque attire set him off to great advantage, and when he had bound the scarf around his waist, and when his hat, placed coquettishly on one side, let fall on his shoulder a stream of ribbons, Franz was forced to confess that costume has much to do with the physical superiority we accord to certain nations. The Turks used to be so picturesque with their long and flowing robes, but are they not now hideous with their blue frocks buttoned up to the chin, and their red caps, which make them look like a bottle of wine with a red seal? Franz complimented Albert, who looked at himself in the glass with an unequivocal smile of satisfaction. They were thus engaged when the Count of Monte Cristo entered. "Gentlemen," said he, "although a companion is agreeable, perfect freedom is sometimes still more agreeable. I come to say that today, and for the remainder of the carnival, I leave the carriage entirely at your disposal. The host will tell you I have 3 or 4 more, so that you will not inconvenience me in any way. Make use of it, I pray you, for your pleasure or your business." The young men wished to decline, but they could find no good reason for refusing an offer which was so agreeable to them. The Count of Monte Cristo remained a quarter of an hour with them, conversing on all subjects with the greatest ease. He was, as we have already said, perfectly well acquainted with the literature of all countries. A glance at the walls of his salon proved to Franz and Albert that he was a connoisseur of pictures. A few words he let fall showed them that he was no stranger to the sciences, and he seemed much occupied with chemistry. The 2 friends did not venture to return the Count the breakfast he had given them. It would have been too absurd to offer him in exchange for his excellent table the very inferior one of Signor Pastrini. They told him so frankly, and he received their excuses with the air of a man who appreciated their delicacy. Albert was charmed with the Count's manners, and he was only prevented from recognizing him for a perfect gentleman by reason of his varied knowledge. The permission to do what he liked with the carriage pleased him above all, for the fair peasants had appeared in a most elegant carriage the preceding evening, and Albert was not sorry to be upon an equal footing with them. At 1:30 they descended. The coachman and footman had put on their livery over their disguises, which gave them a more ridiculous appearance than ever, and which gained them the applause of Franz and Albert. Albert had fastened the faded bunch of violets to his buttonhole. At the first sound of the bell they hastened into the Corso by the Via Vittoria. At the second turn, a bunch of fresh violets, thrown from a carriage filled with harlequins, indicated to Albert that, like himself and his friend, the peasants had changed their costume also, and whether it was the result of chance, or whether a similar feeling had possessed them both, while he had changed his costume, they had assumed his. Albert placed the fresh bouquet in his buttonhole, but he kept the faded one in his hand, and when he again met the calash, he raised it to his lips, an action which seemed greatly to amuse not only the fair lady who had thrown it, but her joyous companions also. The day was as gay as the preceding one, perhaps even more animated and noisy. The Count appeared for an instant at his window, but when they again passed he had disappeared. It is almost needless to say that the flirtation between Albert and the fair peasant continued all day. In the evening, on his return, Franz found a letter from the embassy, informing him that he would have the honor of being received by His Holiness the next day. At each previous visit he had made to Rome, he had solicited and obtained the same favor, and incited as much by a religious feeling as by gratitude. He was unwilling to quit the capital of the Christian world without laying his respectful homage at the feet of one of St. Peter's successors, who has set the rare example of all the virtues. He did not then think of the carnival, for in spite of his condescension and touching kindness, one cannot incline oneself without awe before the venerable and noble old man called Gregory XVI. On his return from the Vatican, Franz carefully avoided the Corso. He brought away with him a treasure of pious thoughts, to which the mad gaiety of the maskers would have been profanation. At 5:10, Albert entered overjoyed. The harlequin had reassumed her peasant's costume, and as she passed, she raised her mask. She was charming. Franz congratulated Albert, who received his congratulations with the air of a man conscious that they are merited. He had recognized by certain unmistakable signs that his fair incognita belonged to the aristocracy. He had made up his mind to write to her the next day. Franz remarked, while he gave these details, that Albert seemed to have something to ask of him, but that he was unwilling to ask it. He insisted upon it, declaring beforehand that he was willing to make any sacrifice the other wished. Albert let himself be pressed just as long as friendship required, and then avowed to Franz that he would do him a great favour by allowing him to occupy the carriage alone the next day. Albert attributed to Franz's absence the extreme kindness of the fair peasant in raising her mask. Franz was not sufficiently egotistical to stop Albert in the middle of an adventure that promised to prove so agreeable to his curiosity and so flattering to his vanity. He felt assured that the perfect indiscretion of his friend would duly inform him of all that happened, and as, during 3 years that he had travelled all over Italy, a similar piece of good fortune had never fallen to his share, Franz was by no means sorry to learn how to act on such an occasion. He therefore promised Albert that he would content himself the morrow with witnessing the carnival from the windows of the Rospoli Palace. The next morning he saw Albert pass and repass, holding an enormous bouquet, which he doubtless meant to make the bearer of his amorous epistle. This belief was changed into certainty when Franz saw the bouquet, conspicuous by a circle of white camellias, in the hand of a charming harlequin dressed in rose-coloured satin. The evening was no longer joy, but delirium. Albert nothing doubted but that the fair unknown would reply in the same manner. Franz anticipated his wishes by saying that the noise fatigued him, and that he should pass the next day in writing and looking over his journal. Albert was not deceived, for the next evening Franz saw him enter triumphantly, shaking a folded paper which he held by one corner. "Well," said he, "was I mistaken?" "She has answered you," cried Franz. "Read." This word was pronounced in a manner impossible to describe. Franz took the letter and read: "Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock. Descend from your carriage opposite the Via dei Pontefici, and follow the Roman peasant who snatches your torch from you. When you arrive at the first step of the Church of San Giacomo, be sure to fasten a knot of rose-coloured ribbons to the shoulder of your harlequin costume, in order that you may be recognized. Until then you will not see me. Constancy and discretion." "Well," asked he, when Franz had finished, "what do you think of that?" "I think that the adventure is assuming a very agreeable appearance." "I think so also," replied Albert, "and I very much fear you will go alone to the Duke of Bracciano's ball." Franz and Albert had received that morning an invitation from the celebrated Roman banker. "Take care, Albert," said Franz. "All the nobility of Rome will be present, and if your fair incognita belong to the higher class of society, she must go there." "Whether she goes there or not, my opinion is still the same," returned Albert. "You have read the letter?" "Yes." "You know how imperfectly the women of the mezzocinto are educated in Italy." This is the name of the lower class. "Yes." "Well, read the letter again. Look at the writing, and find, if you can, any blemish in the language or orthography." The writing was in reality charming, and the orthography irreproachable. "You are born to good fortune," said Franz, as he returned the letter. "Laugh as much as you will," replied Albert. "I am in love." "You alarm me," cried Franz. "I see that I shall not only go alone to the Duke of Bracciano's, but also return to Florence alone." "If my unknown be as amiable as she is beautiful," said Albert, "I shall fix myself at Rome for 6 weeks at least. I adore Rome, and I have always had a great taste for archaeology. Come, 2 or 3 more such adventures, and I do not despair of seeing you a member of the Academy." Doubtless Albert was about to discuss seriously his right to the academic chair, when they were informed that dinner was ready. Albert's love had not taken away his appetite. He hastened with Franz to seat himself, free to recommence the discussion after dinner. After dinner, the Count of Monte Cristo was announced. They had not seen him for 2 days. Signor Pastrini informed them that business had called him to Civitavecchia. He had started the previous evening, and had only returned an hour since. He was charming. Whether he kept a watch over himself, or whether by accident, he did not sound the acrimonious chords that in other circumstances had been touched. He was tonight like everybody else. The man was an enigma to Franz. The Count must feel sure that Franz recognized him, and yet he had not let fall a single word indicating any previous acquaintance between them. On his side, however great Franz's desire was to allude to their former interview, the fear of being disagreeable to the man who had loaded him and his friend with kindness prevented him from mentioning it. The Count had learned that the 2 friends had sent to secure a box at the Argentina Theatre, and were told they were all let. In consequence, he brought them the key of his own. At least such was the apparent motive of his visit. Franz and Albert made some difficulty, alleging their fear of depriving him of it. But the Count replied that, as he was going to the Pali Theatre, the box at the Argentina Theatre would be lost. if they did not profit by it. This assurance determined the two friends to accept it. Franz had by degrees become accustomed to the Count's pallor, which had so forcibly struck him at their first meeting. He could not refrain from admiring the severe beauty of his features, the only defect, or rather the principal quality of which, was the pallor. Truly a Byronic hero! Franz could not, we will not say see him, but even think of him without imagining his stern head upon Manfred's shoulders, or beneath Lara's helmet. His forehead was marked with the line that indicates the constant presence of bitter thoughts. He had the fiery eyes that seem to penetrate to the very soul, and the haughty and disdainful upper lip that gives to the words it utters a peculiar character that impresses them on the minds of those to whom they are addressed. The Count was no longer young, he was at least 40, and yet it was easy to understand that he was formed to rule the young men with whom he associated at present. And, to complete his resemblance with the fantastic heroes of the English poet, the Count seemed to have the power of fascination. Albert was constantly expatiating on their good fortune in meeting such a man. Franz was less enthusiastic, but the Count exercised over him also the ascendancy a strong mind always acquires over mind less domineering. He thought several times of the project the Count had of visiting Paris, and he had no doubt but that, with his eccentric character, his characteristic face, and his colossal fortune, he would produce a great effect there. And yet he did not wish to be at Paris when the Count was there. The evening passed as evenings mostly pass at Italian theatres, that is, not in listening to the music, but in paying visits and conversing. The Countess G. wished to revive the subject of the Count, but Franz announced he had something far newer to tell her, and, in spite of Albert's demonstrations of false modesty, he informed the Countess of the great event which had preoccupied them for the last 3 days. As similar intrigues are not uncommon in Italy, if we may credit travellers, the Countess did not manifest the least incredulity, but congratulated Albert on his success. They promised, upon separating, to meet at the Duke of Bracciano's ball, to which all Rome was invited. The heroine of the bouquet kept her word. She gave Albert no sign of her existence the morrow or the day after. At length Tuesday came, the last and most tumultuous day of the Carnival. On Tuesday the theatres open at 10 o'clock in the morning, as Lent begins after 8 at night. On Tuesday, all those who through want of money, time or enthusiasm have not been to see the Carnival before, mingle in the gaiety and contribute to the noise and excitement. From 2 o'clock till 5 Franz and Albert followed in the fête, exchanging handfuls of confetti with the other carriages and the pedestrians, who crowded amongst the horses' feet and the carriage wheels without a single accident, a single dispute, or a single fight. The fêtes are veritable pleasure days to the Italians. The author of this history, who has resided 5 or 6 years in Italy, does not recollect to have ever seen a ceremony interrupted by one of those events so common in other countries. Albert was triumphant in his harlequin costume. A knot of rose-coloured ribbons fell from his shoulder almost to the ground. In order that there might be no confusion, Franz wore his peasant's costume. As the day advanced, the tumult became greater. There was not on the pavement, in the carriages, at the windows, a single tongue that was silent, a single arm that did not move. It was a human storm, made up of a thunder of cries, and a hail of sweetmeats, flowers, eggs, oranges, and nosegays. At 3 o'clock the sound of fireworks, let off on the Piazza del Popolo and the Piazza di Venezia, heard with difficulty amid the din and confusion, announced that the races were about to begin. The races, like the moccoli, are one of the episodes peculiar to the last days of the Carnival. At the sound of the fireworks the carriages instantly broke ranks, and retired by the adjacent streets. All these evolutions are executed with an inconceivable address and marvellous rapidity, without the police interfering in the matter. The pedestrians ranged themselves against the walls. Then the trampling of horses and the clashing of steel were heard. A detachment of carbineers, 15 abreast, galloped up the Corso in order to clear it for the Barberi. When the detachment arrived at the Piazza di Venezia, a second volley of fireworks was discharged, to announce that the street was clear. Almost instantly, in the midst of a tremendous and general outcry, 7 or 8 horses, excited by the shouts of 300,000 spectators, passed by like lightning. Then the castle of Sant'Angelo fired 3 cannon to indicate that number 3 had won. Immediately, without any other signal, the carriages moved on, flowing on towards the Corso, down all the streets, like torrents pent up for a while, which again flow into the parent river, and the immense stream again continued its course between its 2 granite banks. A new source of noise and movement was added to the crowd. The sellers of moccoletti entered on the scene. The moccoli, or moccoletti, are candles which vary in size from the Paschal taper to the rushlight, and which give to each actor in the great final scene of the carnival two very serious problems to grapple with. First, how to keep his own moccoletto alight, and secondly, how to extinguish the moccoletti of others. The moccoletto is like life. Man has found but one means of transmitting it, and that one comes from God. But he has discovered 1,000 means of taking it away, and the devil has somewhat aided him. The moccoletto is kindled by approaching it to a light. But who can describe the 1,000 means of extinguishing the moccoletto? The gigantic bellows, the monstrous extinguishers, the superhuman fans. Everyone hastened to purchase moccoletti, Franz and Albert among the rest. The night was rapidly approaching, and already at the cry of "Moccoletti," repeated by the shrill voices of 1,000 vendors, 2 or 3 stars began to burn among the crowd. It was a signal. At the end of 10 minutes, 50,000 lights glittered, descending from the Palazzo di Venezia to the Piazza del Popolo, and mounting from the Piazza del Popolo to the Palazzo di Venezia. It seemed like the fate of jack-o'-lanterns. It is impossible to form any idea of it without having seen it. Suppose that all the stars had descended from the sky and mingled in a wild dance on the face of the earth, the whole accompanied by cries that were never heard in any other part of the world. The facchino follows the prince, the Transteverin the citizen, everyone blowing, extinguishing, relighting. Had old Aeolus appeared at this moment, he would have been proclaimed king of the Moccoli, and Aquilo the heir presumptive to the throne. This battle of folly and flame continued for 2 hours. The Corso was light as day. The features of the spectators on the 3rd and 4th stories were visible. Every 5 minutes Albert took out his watch. At length it pointed to 7. The 2 friends were in the Via dei Pontefici. Albert sprang out, bearing his moccoletto in his hand. 2 or 3 masks strove to knock his moccoletto out of his hand, but Albert, a first-rate pugilist, sent them rolling in the street, one after the other, and continued his course towards the church of San Giacomo. The steps were crowded with masks, who strove to snatch each other's torches. Franz followed Albert with his eyes, and saw him mount the first step. Instantly a mask, wearing the well-known costume of a peasant woman, snatched his moccoletto from him without his offering any resistance. Franz was too far off to hear what they said, but without doubt nothing hostile passed, for he saw Albert disappear arm in arm with the peasant girl. He watched them pass through the crowd for some time, but at length he lost sight of them in the Via Marcello. Suddenly the bell that gives the signal for the end of the carnival sounded, and at the same instant all the moccoletti were extinguished, as if by enchantment. It seemed as though one immense blast of the wind had extinguished every one. Franz found himself in utter darkness. No sound was audible, save that of the carriages that were carrying the maskers home. Nothing was visible save a few lights that burnt behind the windows. The carnival was over. End of chapter 36.
Chapter 37 of the Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 37. The Catacombs of Saint Sebastian. In his whole life, perhaps, Franz had never before experienced so sudden an impression, so rapid a transition from gaiety to sadness, as in this moment. It seemed as though Rome, under the magic breath of some demon of the night, had suddenly changed into a vast tomb. By a chance which added yet more to the intensity of the darkness, the moon, which was on the wane, did not rise until 11 o'clock, and the streets which the young man traversed were plunged in the deepest obscurity. The distance was short, and at the end of 10 minutes his carriage, or rather the count's, stopped before the Hôtel de Londres. Dinner was waiting, but as Albert had told him that he should not return so soon, Franz sat down without him. Signor Pastrini, who had been accustomed to see them dine together, inquired into the cause of his absence, but Franz merely replied that Albert had received on the previous evening an invitation which he had accepted. The sudden extinction of the moccoletti, the darkness which had replaced the light, and the silence which had succeeded the turmoil, had left in Franz's mind a certain depression which was not free from uneasiness. He therefore dined very silently, in spite of the officious attention of his host, who presented himself 2 or 3 times to inquire if he wanted anything. Franz resolved to wait for Albert as late as possible. He ordered the carriage, therefore, for 11 o'clock, desiring Signor Pastrini to inform him the moment that Albert returned to the hotel. At 11 o'clock Albert had not come back. Franz dressed himself and went out, telling his host that he was going to pass the night at the Duke of Bracciano's. The house of the Duke of Bracciano is one of the most delightful in Rome. The Duchess, one of the last heiresses of the Colonnas, does its honours with the most consummate grace, and thus their fêtes have a European celebrity. Franz and Albert had brought to Rome letters of introduction to them, and their first question on his arrival was to inquire the whereabouts of his travelling companion. Franz replied that he had left him at the moment they were about to extinguish the moccoli, and that he had lost sight of him in the Via Macello. "Then he has not returned?" said the duke. "I waited for him until this hour," replied Franz. "And do you know whither he went?" "No, not precisely. However, I think it was something very like a rendezvous." "Diavolo!" said the duke. "This is a bad day, or rather a bad night, to be out late. Is it not, countess?" These words were addressed to the Countess G., who had just arrived, and was leaning on the arm of Signor Torlonia, the duke's brother. "I think, on the contrary, that it is a charming night," replied the countess, "and those who are here will complain of but one thing, its too rapid flight." "I am not speaking," said the duke with a smile, "of the persons who are here. The men run no other danger than that of falling in love with you, and the women of falling ill of jealousy at seeing you so lovely. I meant persons who were out in the streets of Rome." "Ah," asked the countess, "who is out in the streets of Rome at this hour, unless it be to go to a ball?" "Our friend Albert de Morcerf, countess, whom I left in pursuit of his unknown about 7 o'clock this evening," said Franz, "and whom I have not seen since." "And don't you know where he is?" "Not at all." "Is he armed?" "He is in masquerade." "You should not have allowed him to go," said the duke to Franz. "You, who know Rome better than he does." "You might as well have tried to stop number 3 of the Barberi, who gained the prize in the race today," replied Franz. "And then, moreover, what could happen to him?" "Who can tell? The night is gloomy, and the Tiber is very near the Via Macello." Franz felt a shudder run through his veins at observing that the feeling of the duke and the countess was so much in unison with his own personal disquietude. "I informed them at the hotel that I had the honor of passing the night here, duke," said Franz, "and desired them to come and inform me of his return." "Ah," replied the duke, "here, I think, is one of my servants who is seeking you." The duke was not mistaken. When he saw Franz, the servant came up to him. "Your excellency," he said, "the master of the Hôtel de Londres has sent to let you know that a man is waiting for you with a letter from the Vicomte of Morcerf." "A letter from the Vicomte?" exclaimed Franz. "Yes." "And who is the man?" "I do not know." "Why did he not bring it to me here?" "The messenger did not say." "And where is the messenger?" "He went away directly he saw me enter the ballroom to find you." "Oh," said the countess to Franz, "go with all speed. Poor young man! Perhaps some accident has happened to him." "I will hasten," replied Franz. "Shall we see you again to give us any information?" inquired the countess. Yes, if it is not any serious affair. Otherwise I cannot answer as to what I may do myself." "Be prudent in any event," said the countess. "Oh, pray be assured of that." Franz took his hat and went away in haste. He had sent away his carriage with orders for it to fetch him at 2 o'clock. Fortunately, the Palazzo Bracciano, which is on one side in the Corso, and the other in the Square of the Holy Apostles, is hardly 10 minutes' walk from the Hôtel de Londres. As he came near the hotel, Franz saw a man in the middle of the street. He had no doubt that it was the messenger from Albert. The man was wrapped up in a large cloak. He went up to him, but, to his extreme astonishment, the stranger first addressed him. "What wants your excellency of me?" inquired the man, retreating a step or two, as if to keep on his guard. "Are not you the person who brought me a letter?" inquired Franz. "From the Vicomte of Morcerf?" "Your excellency lodges at Pastrini's hotel?" "I do." "Your excellency is the travelling companion of the Vicomte?" "I am." "Your excellency's name?" "Is the Baron Franz d'Épinay." "Then it is to your excellency that this letter is addressed." "Is there any answer?" inquired Franz, taking the letter from him. "Yes, your friend at least hopes so." "Come upstairs with me, and I will give it to you." "I prefer waiting here," said the messenger with a smile. "And why?" "Your excellency will know when you have read the letter." "Shall I find you here, then?" "Certainly." Franz entered the hotel. On the staircase he met Signor Pastrini. "Well?" said the landlord. "Well, what?" responded Franz. "You have seen the man who desired to speak with you from your friend?" he asked of Franz. "Yes, I have seen him," he replied, "and he has handed this letter to me. Light the candles in my apartment, if you please." The innkeeper gave orders to a servant to go before Franz with a light. The young man had found Signor Pastrini looking very much alarmed, and this had only made him the more anxious to read Albert's letter. And so he went instantly towards the wax light and unfolded it. It was written and signed by Albert. Franz read it twice before he could comprehend what it contained. It was thus worded: "My dear fellow, the moment you have received this, have the kindness to take the letter of credit from my pocketbook, which you will find in the square drawer of the secretary. Add your own to it, if it be not sufficient. Run to Torlonia, draw from him instantly 4,000 piastres, and give them to the bearer. It is urgent that I should have this money without delay. I do not say more, relying on you as you may rely on me. Your friend, Albert de Morcerf. P.S. I now believe in Italian banditti." Below these lines were written in a strange hand the following in Italian: "Se alle 6 della mattina le 4.000 piastre non sono nelle mie mani, alle 7 il conte Alberto avrà cessato di vivere. Luigi Vampa." If by 6 in the morning the 4,000 piastres are not in my hands, by 7 o'clock the Count Albert will have ceased to live. This second signature explained everything to Franz, who now understood the objection of the messenger to coming up into the apartment. The street was safer for him. Albert, then, had fallen into the hands of the famous bandit chief, in whose existence he had for so long a time refused to believe. There was no time to lose. He hastened to open the secretary, and found the pocketbook in the drawer, and in it the letter of credit. There were in all 6,000 piastres, but of these 6,000 Albert had already expended 3,000. As to Franz, he had no letter of credit, as he lived at Florence, and had only come to Rome to pass 7 or 8 days. He had brought but 100 louis, and of these he had not more than 50 left. Thus 700 or 800 piastres were wanting to them both to make up the sum that Albert required. True, he might in such a case rely on the kindness of Signor Torlonia. He was therefore about to return to the Palazzo Bracciano without loss of time, when suddenly a luminous idea crossed his mind. He remembered the Count of Monte Cristo. Franz was about to ring for Signor Pastrini when that worthy presented himself. "My dear sir," he said hastily, "do you know if the count is within?" "Yes, your excellency, he has this moment returned." "Is he in bed?" "I should say no." "Then ring at his door, if you please, and request him to be so kind as to give me an audience." Signor Pastrini did as he was desired, and returning 5 minutes after, he said, "The count awaits your excellency." Franz went along the corridor, and a servant introduced him to the count. He was in a small room which Franz had not yet seen, and which was surrounded with divans. The count came towards him. "Well, what good wind blows you hither at this hour?" said he. "Have you come to sup with me? It would be very kind of you." "No, I have come to speak to you of a very serious matter." "A serious matter?" said the count, looking at Franz with the earnestness usual to him. "And what may it be?" "Are we alone?" "Yes," replied the count, going to the door and returning. Franz gave him Albert's letter. "Read that," he said. The count read it. "Well, well," said he, "did you see the postscript?" "I did indeed." "Se alle 6 della mattina le 4.000 piastre non sono nelle mie mani, alle 7 il conte Alberto avrà cessato di vivere. Luigi Vampa." "What think you of that?" inquired Franz. "Have you the money he demands?" "Yes, all but 800 piastres." The count went to his secretary, opened it, and pulling out a drawer filled with gold, said to Franz, "I hope you will not offend me by applying to anyone but myself." "You see, on the contrary, I come to you first and instantly," replied Franz, "and I thank you. Have what you will." And he made a sign to Franz to take what he pleased. "Is it absolutely necessary, then, to send the money to Luigi Vampa?" asked the young man, looking fixedly in his turn at the count. "Judge for yourself," replied he. "The postscript is explicit." "I think that if you would take the trouble of reflecting, you could find a way of simplifying the negotiation," said Franz. "How so?" returned the count with surprise. "If we were to go together to Luigi Vampa, I am sure he would not refuse you Albert's freedom." "What influence can I possibly have over a bandit?" "Have you not just rendered him a service that can never be forgotten?" "What is that?" "Have you not saved Peppino's life?" "Well, well," said the count, "who told you that?" "No matter, I know it." The count knit his brows and remained silent an instant. "And if I went to seek Vampa, would you accompany me?" "If my society would not be disagreeable." "Be it so. It is a lovely night, and a walk without Rome will do us both good." "Shall I take any arms?" "For what purpose?" "Any money?" "It is useless. Where is the man who brought the letter?" "In the street." "He awaits the answer?" "Yes." "I must learn where we are going. I will summon him hither." "It is useless, he would not come up." "To your apartments, perhaps, but he will not make any difficulty at entering mine." The count went to the window of the apartment that looked on to the street, and whistled in a peculiar manner. The man in the mantle quitted the wall, and advanced into the middle of the street. "Salite!" said the count, in the same tone in which he would have given an order to his servant. The messenger obeyed without the least hesitation, but rather with alacrity, and mounting the steps at a bound, entered the hotel. 5 seconds afterwards he was at the door of the room. "Ah, it is you, Peppino," said the count. But Peppino, instead of answering, threw himself on his knees, seized the count's hand, and covered it with kisses. "Ah," said the count, "you have then not forgotten that I saved your life?" "That is strange, for it is a week ago." "No, Excellency, and never shall I forget it," returned Peppino, with an accent of profound gratitude. "Never? That is a long time. But it is something that you believe so. Rise and answer." Peppino glanced anxiously at Franz. "Oh, you may speak before his Excellency," said he. "He is one of my friends. You allow me to give you this title?" continued the count in French. "It is necessary to excite this man's confidence." "You can speak before me," said Franz. "I am a friend of the count's." "Good," returned Peppino. "I am ready to answer any questions your Excellency may address to me." "How did the Vicomte Albert fall into Luigi's hands?" "Excellency, the Frenchman's carriage passed several times the one in which was Teresa." "The chief's mistress?" "Yes, the Frenchman threw her a bouquet. Teresa returned it, all this with the consent of the chief, who was in the carriage." "What?" cried Franz. "Was Luigi Vampa in the carriage with the Roman peasants?" "It was he who drove, disguised as the coachman," replied Peppino. "Well?" said the count. "Well, then, the Frenchman took off his mask. Teresa, with the chief's consent, did the same. The Frenchman asked for a rendezvous. Teresa gave him one, only, instead of Teresa, it was Beppo who was on the steps of the church of San Giacomo." "What!" exclaimed Franz, "the peasant girl who snatched his moccoletto from him?" "Was a lad of 15," replied Peppino. "But it was no disgrace to your friend to have been deceived. Beppo has taken in plenty of others." "And Beppo led him outside the walls?" said the count. "Exactly so. A carriage was waiting at the end of the Via Macello. Beppo got in, inviting the Frenchman to follow him, and he did not wait to be asked twice. He gallantly offered the right-hand seat to Beppo, and sat by him. Beppo told him he was going to take him to a villa a league from Rome. The Frenchman assured him he would follow him to the end of the world. The coachman went up the Via di Ripetta and the Porta San Paola, and when they were 200 yards outside, as the Frenchman became somewhat too forward, Beppo put a brace of pistols to his head, the coachman pulled up and did the same. At the same time 4 of the band, who were concealed on the banks of the Almo, surrounded the carriage. The Frenchman made some resistance and nearly strangled Beppo, but he could not resist 5 armed men, and was forced to yield. They made him get out, walk along the banks of the river, and then brought him to Teresa and Luigi, who were waiting for him in the catacombs of Saint Sebastian. "Well," said the count, turning towards Franz, "it seems to me that this is a very likely story. What do you say to it?" "Why, that I should think it very amusing," replied Franz, "if it had happened to anyone but poor Albert." "And in truth, if you had not found me here," said the count, "it might have proved a gallant adventure which would have cost your friend dear. But now, be assured, his alarm will be the only serious consequence." "And shall we go and find him?" inquired Franz. "Oh, decidedly, sir. He is in a very picturesque place. Do you know the catacombs of Saint Sebastian?" "I was never in them, but I have often resolved to visit them." "Well, here is an opportunity made to your hand, and it would be difficult to contrive a better. Have you a carriage?" "No." "That is of no consequence. I always have one ready, day and night." "Always ready?" "Yes, I am a very capricious being, and I should tell you that sometimes when I rise, or after my dinner, or in the middle of the night, I resolve on starting for some particular point, and away I go." The count rang, and a footman appeared. "Order out the carriage," he said, "and remove the pistols which are in the holsters. You need not awaken the coachman. Ali will drive." In a very short time the noise of wheels was heard, and the carriage stopped at the door. The count took out his watch. "12:30," he said. "We might start at 5 o'clock and be in time, but the delay may cause your friend to pass an uneasy night, and therefore we had better go with all speed to extricate him from the hands of the infidels. Are you still resolved to accompany me?" "More determined than ever." "Well, then, come along." Franz and the count went downstairs, accompanied by Peppino. At the door they found the carriage. Ali was on the box, in whom Franz recognized the dumb slave of the grotto of Monte Cristo. Franz and the count got into the carriage. Peppino placed himself beside Ali, and they set off at a rapid pace. Ali had received his instructions, and went down the Corso, crossed the Campo Vaccino, went up the Strada San Gregorio, and reached the gates of Saint Sebastian. Then the porter raised some difficulties, but the Count of Monte Cristo produced a permit from the governor of Rome, allowing him to leave or enter the city at any hour of the day or night. The portcullis was therefore raised, the porter had a louis for his trouble, and they went on their way. The road which the carriage now traversed was the ancient Appian Way, and bordered with tombs. From time to time, by the light of the moon, which began to rise, Franz imagined that he saw something like a sentinel appear at various points among the ruins, and suddenly retreat into the darkness on a signal from Peppino. A short time before they reached the Baths of Caracalla, the carriage stopped. Peppino opened the door, and the count and Franz alighted. "In 10 minutes," said the count to his companion, "we shall be there." He then took Peppino aside, gave him an order in a low voice, and Peppino went away, taking with him a torch brought with them in the carriage. 5 minutes elapsed, during which Franz saw the shepherd going along a narrow path that led over the irregular and broken surface of the Campagna, and finally he disappeared in the midst of the tall red herbage, which seemed like the bristling mane of an enormous lion. "Now," said the count, "let us follow him." Franz and the count, in their turn, then, advanced along the same path, which, at the distance of 100 paces, led them over a declivity to the bottom of a small valley. They then perceived 2 men conversing in the obscurity. "Ought we to go on?" asked Franz of the count, "or shall we wait a while?" "Let us go on. Peppino will have warned the sentry of our coming." One of the 2 men was Peppino, and the other a bandit on the lookout. Franz and the count advanced, and the bandit saluted them. "Your Excellency," said Peppino, addressing the count, "if you will follow me, the opening of the catacombs is close at hand." "Go on, then," replied the count. They came to an opening behind a clump of bushes and in the midst of a pile of rocks, by which a man could scarcely pass. Peppino glided first into this crevice. After they got along a few paces, the passage widened. Peppino passed, lighted his torch, and turned to see if they came after him. The count first reached an open space, and Franz followed him closely. The passageway sloped in a gentle descent, enlarging as they proceeded. Still Franz and the count were compelled to advance in a stooping posture, and were scarcely able to proceed abreast of one another. They went on 150 paces in this way, and then were stopped by, "Who comes there?" At the same time they saw the reflection of a torch on a carbon barrel. "A friend," responded Peppino, and advancing alone towards the sentry, he said a few words to him in a low tone, and then he, like the first, saluted the nocturnal visitors, making a sign that they might proceed. Behind the sentinel was a staircase with 20 steps. Franz and the count descended these, and found themselves in a mortuary chamber. 5 corridors diverged like the rays of a star, and the walls, dug into niches, which were arranged one above the other in the shape of coffins, showed that they were at last in the catacombs. Down one of the corridors, whose extent it was impossible to determine, rays of light were visible. The count laid his hand on Franz's shoulder. "Would you like to see a camp of bandits in repose?" he inquired. "Exceedingly," replied Franz. "Come with me, then. Peppino, put out the torch." Peppino obeyed, and Franz and the count were in utter darkness, except that 50 paces in advance of them a reddish glare, more evident since Peppino had put out his torch, was visible along the wall. They advanced silently, the count guiding Franz, as if he had the singular faculty of seeing in the dark. Franz himself, however, saw his way more plainly in proportion as he went on towards the light, which served in some manner as a guide. 3 arcades were before them, and the middle one was used as a door. These arcades opened on one side into the corridor where the count and Franz were, and on the other into a large square chamber, entirely surrounded by niches similar to those of which we have spoken. In the midst of this chamber were 4 stones, which had formerly served as an altar, as was evident from the cross which still surmounted them. A lamp, placed at the base of a pillar, lighted up with its pale and flickering flame the singular scene which presented itself to the eyes of the 2 visitors concealed in the shadow. A man was seated with his elbow leaning on the column, and was reading with his back turned to the arcades, through the openings of which the newcomers contemplated him. This was the chief of the band, Luigi Vampa. Around him, and in groups, according to their fancy, lying in their mantles, or with their backs against a sort of stone bench, which went all round the columbarium, were to be seen 20 brigands or more, each having his carbine within reach. At the other end, silent, scarcely visible, and like a shadow, was a sentinel, who was walking up and down before a grotto, which was only distinguishable because in that spot the darkness seemed more dense than elsewhere. When the count thought Franz had gazed sufficiently on this picturesque tableau, he raised his finger to his lips to warn him to be silent, and, ascending the 3 steps which led to the corridor of the columbarium, entered the chamber by the middle arcade, and advanced towards Vampa, who was so intent on the book before him that he did not hear the noise of his footsteps. "Who comes there?" cried the sentinel, who was less abstracted, and who saw by the lamplight a shadow approaching his chief. At this challenge Vampa rose quickly, drawing at the same moment a pistol from his girdle. In a moment all the bandits were on their feet, and 20 carbines were levelled at the count. "Well," said he in a voice perfectly calm, and no muscle of his countenance disturbed, "well, my dear Vampa, it appears to me that you receive a friend with a great deal of ceremony." "Ground arms!" exclaimed the chief with an imperative sign of the hand, while with the other he took off his hat respectfully. Then, turning to the singular personage who had caused this scene, he said, "Your pardon, your Excellency, but I was so far from expecting the honor of a visit that I did not really recognize you." "It seems that your memory is equally short in everything, Vampa," said the count, "and that not only do you forget people's faces, but also the conditions you make with them." "What conditions have I forgotten, your Excellency?" inquired the bandit, with the air of a man who, having committed an error, is anxious to repair it. "Was it not agreed," asked the count, "that not only my person, but also that of my friends, should be respected by you?" "And how have I broken that treaty, your Excellency?" "You have this evening carried off and conveyed hither the Vicomte Albert de Morcerf. Well," continued the count in a tone that made Franz shudder, "this young gentleman is one of my friends. This young gentleman lodges in the same hotel as myself. This young gentleman has been up and down the Corso for 8 hours in my private carriage, and yet I repeat to you, you have carried him off and conveyed him hither, and," added the count, taking the letter from his pocket, "you have set a ransom on him as if he were an utter stranger." "Why did you not tell me all this, you?" inquired the brigand chief, turning towards his men, who all retreated before his look. "Why have you caused me thus to fail in my word towards a gentleman like the count, who has all our lives in his hands? By heavens, if I thought one of you knew that the young gentleman was the friend of his Excellency, I would blow his brains out with my own hand." "Well," said the count, turning towards Franz, "I told you there was some mistake in this." "Are you not alone?" asked Vampa with uneasiness. "I am with the person to whom this letter was addressed, and to whom I desired to prove that Luigi Vampa was a man of his word. Come, your Excellency," the count added, turning to Franz, "here is Luigi Vampa, who will himself express to you his deep regret at the mistake he has committed." Franz approached, the chief advancing several steps to meet him. "Welcome among us, your Excellency," he said to him. "You heard what the count just said, and also my reply. Let me add that I would not for the 4,000 piastres at which I had fixed your friend's ransom, that this had happened." "But," said Franz, looking round him uneasily, "where is the Vicomte? I do not see him." "Nothing has happened to him, I hope," said the count frowningly. "The prisoner is there," replied Vampa, pointing to the hollow space in front of which the bandit was on guard, "and I will go myself and tell him he is free." The chief went towards the place he had pointed out as Albert's prison, and Franz and the count followed him. "What is the prisoner doing?" inquired Vampa of the sentinel. "Ma foi, captain," replied the sentry, "I do not know. For the last hour I have not heard him stir." "Come in, your Excellency," said Vampa. The count and Franz ascended 7 or 8 steps after the chief, who drew back a bolt and opened a door. Then, by the gleam of a lamp similar to that which lighted the columbarium, Albert was to be seen wrapped up in a cloak which one of the bandits had lent him, lying in a corner in profound slumber. "Come," said the count, smiling with his own peculiar smile, "not so bad for a man who is to be shot at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning." Vampa looked at Albert with a kind of admiration. He was not insensible to such a proof of courage. "You are right, your excellency," he said. "This must be one of your friends." Then going to Albert, he touched him on the shoulder, saying, "Will your excellency please to awaken?" Albert stretched out his arms, rubbed his eyelids, and opened his eyes. "Oh," said he, "is it you, captain? You should have allowed me to sleep. I had such a delightful dream. I was dancing the galop at Torlonia's with the Countess G." Then he drew his watch from his pocket that he might see how time sped. "1:30 only?" said he. "Why the devil do you rouse me at this hour?" "To tell you that you are free, your excellency." "My dear fellow," replied Albert with a perfect ease of mind, "remember for the future Napoleon's maxim, 'Never awaken me but for bad news.' If you had let me sleep on, I should have finished my gallop, and have been grateful to you all my life. So then, they have paid my ransom?" "No, your excellency." "Well then, how am I free?" "A person to whom I can refuse nothing has come to demand you." "Come hither?" "Yes, hither." "Really? Then that person is a most amiable person." Albert looked around and perceived Franz. "What," said he, "is it you, my dear Franz, whose devotion and friendship are thus displayed?" "No, not I," replied Franz, "but our neighbor, the Count of Monte Cristo." "Oh, my dear count," said Albert gaily, arranging his cravat and wristbands, "you are really most kind, and I hope you will consider me as under eternal obligations to you, in the first place for the carriage, and in the next for this visit." And he put out his hand to the count, who shuddered as he gave his own, but who nevertheless did give it. The bandit gazed on this scene with amazement. He was evidently accustomed to see his prisoners tremble before him, and yet here was one whose gay temperament was not for a moment altered. As for Franz, he was enchanted at the way in which Albert had sustained the national honor in the presence of the bandit. "My dear Albert," he said, "if you will make haste, we shall yet have time to finish the night at Torlonia's. You may conclude your interrupted gallop, so that you will owe no ill will to Signor Luigi, who has indeed throughout this whole affair acted like a gentleman." "You are decidedly right, and we may reach the palazzo by 2 o'clock. Signor Luigi," continued Albert, "is there any formality to fulfill before I take leave of your excellency?" "None, sir," replied the bandit. "You are as free as air." "Well, then, a happy and merry life to you. Come, gentlemen, come." And Albert, followed by Franz and the count, descended the staircase, crossed the square chamber where stood all the bandits, hat in hand. "Peppino," said the brigand chief, "give me the torch." "What are you going to do?" inquired the count. "I will show you the way back myself," said the captain. "That is the least honor that I can render to your excellency." And taking the lighted torch from the hands of the herdsman, he preceded his guests, not as a servant who performs an act of civility, but like a king who precedes ambassadors. On reaching the door, he bowed. "And now, your excellency," added he, "allow me to repeat my apologies. and I hope you will not entertain any resentment at what has occurred." "No, my dear Vampa," replied the count. "Besides, you compensate for your mistakes in so gentlemanly a way that one almost feels obliged to you for having committed them. Gentlemen," added the chief, turning towards the young men, "perhaps the offer may not appear very tempting to you, but if you should ever feel inclined to pay me a second visit, wherever I may be, you shall be welcome." Franz and Albert bowed. The count went out first, then Albert. Franz paused for a moment. "Has your excellency anything to ask me?" said Vampa with a smile. "Yes, I have," replied Franz. "I am curious to know what work you were perusing with so much attention as we entered." "Caesar's Commentaries," said the bandit. "It is my favorite work." "Well, are you coming?" asked Albert. "Yes," replied Franz, "here I am." And he in his turn left the caves. They advanced to the plain. "Ah, your pardon," said Albert, turning round. "Will you allow me, captain?" And he lighted his cigar at Vampa's torch. "Now, my dear count," he said, "let us on with all the speed we may. I am enormously anxious to finish my night at the Duke of Bracciano's." They found the carriage where they had left it. The count said a word in Arabic to Ali, and the horses went on at great speed. It was just 2 o'clock by Albert's watch when the two friends entered into the dancing room. Their return was quite an event, but as they entered together, all uneasiness on Albert's account ceased instantly. "Madame," said the Viscount of Morcerf, advancing towards the countess, "yesterday you were so condescending as to promise me a gallop. I am rather late in claiming this gracious promise, but here is my friend, whose character for veracity you well know, and he will assure you the delay arose from no fault of mine." And as at this moment the orchestra gave the signal for the waltz, Albert put his arm round the waist of the countess and disappeared with her in the whirl of dancers. In the meanwhile, Franz was considering the singular shudder that had passed over the Count of Monte Cristo at the moment when he had been, in some sort, forced to give his hand to Albert. Chapter 37.